Thank you. Thank you so much, Zehra, for that very generous introduction, and thank you all for being here. It's been really fun. Aasim and I did like a little session to figure out like what we would present on. It was already super productive to have that conversation, so I really look forward to being in conversation with you all and hearing your thoughts on this work. So I'll dive right in. So an elderly man, this is a moment from my field work, an elderly man entered the National Database and Registration Authority, NADRA's mega registration center in Islamabad. This is the office where Islamabad come for all of their biometric identity card needs, an ID card for the very first time, or for making any number of changes to their identification data, from date of birth to a change of marital status. The data entry operator at the station this man was led to did his due diligence and pulled up this man's record through his unique ID number that's on his card. Clicking through the record, the data entry operator's first question to the man was, "Is your wife in your family tree?" So mirror of the data entry operator's station faced the elderly man, as it faces all applicants on these data entry stations which dot the floor. So the old man looked very confused at this question and said, "But she's dead, her bones are even gone now. How would she be in your computer?" And the data entry operator responded that even if someone is dead, once they're in the database, they get buried in here too. So this raises the question of how and why would your dead kin end up buried in a government's identity database? NADRA, the National Database and Registration Authority in Pakistan, began its operations in the year 2000 and is now one of the largest centralized national identity databases in the world, with 176 million registered Pakistanis. Its significance lies in its ubiquity. The card is used for banking, for paying bills, for property transactions, voting, the list goes on. And NADRA's custom-made software integrates and verifies data from individuals and kin units to determine who is a Pakistani citizen, sometimes even changing individuals' and families' status from citizen to alien. And I first became attuned to the significance of kinship and really genealogical thinking for NADRA's identification practices when early on during my fieldwork, I met the ex-chairman and original architect of NADRA. And at that time, as I expressed that I was interested in NADRA for my doctoral research, much to my surprise, he responded with, "Yes, NADRA is made for an anthropological study." Mm-hmm. And this was not something I was expecting, and it also wasn't because of the kind of demographic data that they collected, but because, he explained, NADRA operated by tracing kin networks. So to know who someone is, they had to know who they were related to. So the ex-chairman explained that while each card has a unique ID number, and I've blanked out my ID number from my card, as someone told me I should, there were two other numbers that were on the back end of the database. The first is a beta number that links a person with their spouse if they have one, and so extends into a different family tree from your consanguineous, from the natal family that you're born into. And the second one was a khandan number, a family number, which was specifically developed by NADRA for the extended joint family system in Pakistan, so that members of a single household could be listed under that unique number. And in that very first meeting, I learned that NADRA was built upon a legacy system of earlier paper registries of identity card records, now scanned and digitally available, through which NADRA officials could then trace descent. And as individuals' unique ID numbers were continually being linked to one another, this would ultimately create what NADRA's architect referred to as the quote-unquote global family, a database network of Pakistani kin across the country and abroad. And this kin-based logic of the NADRA database is reflected in the fact that any person not linked to at least one other person within the database is flagged as what is called a quote-unquote system independent. So that's an individual without a family in the database. But what happens if you're connected to the wrong family member? By this I mean someone NADRA deems you're not truly related to. This is what produces the technological category of what NADRA calls the family intruder. Now, a family intruder is a person who has allegedly, fraudulently claimed to be the parent, child, or sibling of an already identified individual within the database. And so, in Nadra's terms, has intruded into the family. And this is generated in a number of ways, but basically when the individual's attributes within the database suggest that it might not actually belong to the family unit that it is claiming. So Nadra's mode of recording kinship is as much about identifying who's on the inside as it is about managing those right at the boundary. The family intruder, I would argue, is not an exception to the database, but central to its very function. The ability to individuate is fundamentally interlinked with the ability to map relatedness. This raises the question for me, how did the process of establishing individual citizen identity come to rely upon kin networks? And what are the pre-digital histories of such a process? And what are its connections to the long-standing ways in which identity in South Asia was connected to status, caste, and other forms of community belonging? So Nadra is somewhat unsurprisingly built on earlier documentary systems, now incorporated into a database mode of identification, producing this layered information infrastructure, both paper and digital. However, the story of identification, both documentary and otherwise, in South Asia does not make its way into the history of contemporary identification and information infrastructures in an uncomplicated or simply linear way. The use of kinship for establishing identity can sometimes get hastily tied into a colonial history of codifying group identity according to caste, kin, and tribe. And this is precisely what I want to pull apart and interrogate today. So the 1970s, the period during which Pakistan built its national identification system, kinship as information was coming to be retooled for governance and control over a seemingly unknowable population. And I argue that such a configuration of individuating practices presents somewhat of a departure from earlier informational governance strategies that were primarily reliant on classificatory schemas, most prominently the colonial census and its enumeration of identity categories. Historians of modern disciplinary forms, most prominently in a Foucauldian strain, reveal how power works through the production of knowledge about social categories, which importantly act not just on the group, but directly on the individual as well. However, what is obfuscated in this view is how processes of classification were and continue to be distinct from processes of individuation. So, while classification in a formal sense works to put all things of the same type into one box, individuation works to differentiate between each of those entities of the same type. So for Nadra and its paper predecessor, the trouble lies in the potential similarity between individuals. So we're actually more alike in some ways to a database or a registry than we are different. So yeah, it wants to disambiguate one individual from another, not place what it considers the same sociological identity into the same box. It can do that, I want to be careful with this, that can do that based on the data it collects, for example, gender. So it knows how many women there are in a database, and so it can tell you how many of them are there. But that's not its primary function. And we see that in the fact that, Pakistan this is the first year it'll hold a digital census. So why does this distinction between individuation and classification matter at all? I would say because systems of individuation actually create new kinds of trackable individuals, and by extension, a distinct set of political conflicts and claims. Moreover, I think this difference is also historical. Nadra, fundamentally a system that performs individuation, stands in contrast to the classification-based regime of governance that was so central to taxonomizing identity in South Asia. So Pakistan's first paper-based national identity registry presents a significant historical turning point in the move towards individuation by a governmental regime. Built after the creation of Bangladesh in 1972, the National Identity Registry reflected a transformation in bureaucratic approaches to information. In this paper registry, we can see the Pakistani state's preoccupation with building an information infrastructure specifically for the purpose of producing discrete and uniquely identifiable individuals. So Pakistan's first identification regime was an unprecedented scheme launched in 1973, producing what Nadra today somewhat derogatory in a derogatory way calls the manual national identity card. And this earlier information infrastructure with its pre-digital dreams of computational power involved registering all Pakistani citizens. It didn't succeed in this, but that was the goal. Through this, it sought to identify, in its own language, an internal enemy, a nebulously defined figure that emerged in the wake of the civil war between East and West Pakistan in 1971. Nadra's direct and non-digital predecessor was built to more sharply define the outsiders who were already on the inside. So in the aftermath of the 1971 war, Pakistan had to negotiate a population transfer of ethnic Bengalis from West Pakistan to what had just become Bangladesh, which had previously been East Pakistan. So identity registration at this time entailed recasting the status of those who had once been Pakistani citizens but were now Bangladeshis and had to be identified as such. So to do this, the existing documentary mechanisms, for example, passports, were proving insufficient at the time, in part because the Pakistani state apprehended Bangladeshis crossing Pakistan's borders after 1971 using their old Pakistani passports. So during a Pakistan National Assembly session dedicated to discussing the National Registration Act in July 1973, and the act was debated and contested at the time. There was one parliamentarian, for example, Sayyid Abbas Hussain Gardezi, who argued that the identification regime would allow the government to distinguish between those who are quote-unquote useful, mufid, for the country, and those who are enemies. The identity card would function like a, quote, spider's web, catching the moths and flies that it encountered. Our country has a wide and, quote, our country has a wide and porous border, and the enemy is embedded within the border. Through the identity card, we will identify the enemies, argued the Interior Minister while proposing the bill. So in this moment, the post-colonial state tried to develop an information technology to address the very specific problems produced by re-territorialization and the compounding political and social uncertainty that it produced. The project for national individuation was directed at a specific kind of knowledge, establishing the unique identity of all within the country. And in so doing, it not only dealt with the ambiguities of citizenship, which were certainly there, but it also served as a surveillance technology during this intensifying Cold War politics on Pakistan's western frontier with Afghanistan. So the growing preoccupation with internal enemies was connected to the Soviet influence in the region at the time, but actually also very much about Pakistan's own resistance movements. So the Pakistani state attempted to consolidate its control over a number of these dissident elements, not solely through brutal repression, which it certainly did, but also by extending its informational reach into society. And this process involved acquiring information about who was who and building a mechanism to continually reevaluate the citizen-foreigner boundary. And we see this very clearly in 1976, so that's 3 years after the ID card scheme had been launched. And at this point, technocrats sent a report of proposals to address the problem of foreign nationals acquiring Pakistani identity cards. The group that they were particularly concerned with were in fact Afghans residing in Pakistan, specifically in the Northwest Frontier Province and in Balochistan. And very quickly, discussions between these bureaucrats revealed that it was actually unclear whether all of these Afghans could even be characterized as foreigners. So in part, this was because many Afghans share ethnicity, language, and kin with Pakistani Pashtuns and have historically lived on both sides of the border. And bureaucrats managing this newly crafted identification system identified not only a singular Afghan national identity, but 4 different kinds of Afghans in Pakistan. They distinguished between these groups based on, first, how long these individuals had been living in Pakistan, whether these individuals owned immovable property in Pakistan, whether they held naturalization or citizenship certificates, and last, if their names showed up in electoral rolls. So why I'm going into this detail is because I want to bring your attention to the actual mechanism of individuation. Even as registration officials, and in this case intelligence officials, were overtly concerned with group identity, ethnic and national, the scale at which they were approaching the question of identity was at the level of the individual. The task at hand was not only to make a national population, such as the case in enumeration or collecting census data, but to refine an information system that could make discrete individuals identifiable as citizens or foreigners. However, in the context of continuing uncertainty, this individuation remained provisional. As the ambiguity surrounding the Afghan question demonstrates, the mechanisms for individuation were pulled between these competing ideas of the nation as a collection of individuals or a collection of social groups. So one means of resolving this tension involved deploying kinship as a source of information to verify identity. And we see this being built into the protocols of information collection itself. And there were two primary paper forms that had to be filled out for getting your ID card. Form A had the applicant's personal information, the basic biodata, address, photograph, identification marks. But Form B included the bulk of information about kinship and was essentially this list of family members who were the dependents of the head of household. And Form B shows how registration officials thought that individual identity would best be verified through information about familial links. In other words, a lone, isolated individual within this schema, Form A alone, was much more likely in this imagination to be a foreigner than someone who had a whole authenticated family in the registry, represented here through Form B. So you might note here the structural resonance with the database's categories of system independent or family intruder. And to deal with the problem of foreign nationals acquiring identity cards, a further restriction was added. And this required the head of household or other family member to physically accompany their next of kin applying for an ID card to the registration office. So instrumentalizing kinship here, the information system recruited a world of social and familial relations as a means to authenticate individual identity. And I want to emphasize here that kin relations don't just stand in as a proxy for group identity. Rather, they allow the registry to create links, a documentary network between individuals to then create this chain of verification. And this paper-based infrastructure continues to be a central part of NADRA's database. It provides the foundation for vertical kin links upon which the digital architecture is built. And you might remember the elderly man I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. Through this now digital record-keeping system, his wife, even if she's dead, is entombed within this infrastructure that keeps relations intact and searchable. I want to also talk about the fact that the desire for computational power was built into the design of this paper-based registry from the outset, even if that was not fully realized at the time. So registration officials then knew that identification would never work properly unless it was computerized. And it's kind of almost tragic when you read these documents because they're like lamenting their lack of computers in the 70s. And retired employees also told me this, that the earlier paper-based system attempted data entry through key punch operators. And they wanted to purchase this big central computer with sufficient computational capacity to handle data coming in from all over the country. But ultimately, of course, such a system never fully materialized due to the enormous financial constraints. And so without this centralized network, the officials were really limited in their capacity to prevent people from duplicating their ID records. So one of the central problems was that even though the paper registry was using these unique serial numbers on ID cards and recorded these within a central population register, the scale was localized to the district level. So they could not deduplicate and catch identity fraud by automatically cross-checking between different locations, something NADRA ultimately did enable through automation and centralization. So even as the computational limitations of this manual system were all too apparent to the technocrats who built it, Pakistan's first identity registry, I think, marks a moment where the state, the Pakistani state, becomes interested in knowing its own population in this very specific way, as individuals. But this is not solely an account of the emergence of an identifiable individual. It tells a larger story about shifts within the logics and technologies of rule and visions of the social political. And so thus far, I've focused on how Nadra and its predecessor were, for the most part, unconcerned with classification in terms of sorting individuals into social and cultural categories. But I don't want to ignore a central paradox here that the project represents. So even as Nadra and its predecessor both explicitly focused on the individual, they still reproduced markers of difference without sometimes explicitly recording the already existing social identity markers. And it's this that reveals the ways that the political stakes of Nadra lie not only in its novel possibilities for surveillance, a function of its individuating tracking technology, or is its classificatory refusal, but in fact the interconnections between individuation and classification. And one site for situating these interconnections and indeed the contradictory logics of classificatory versus individuation technologies, which led technologies of governance to where they are now, which is the identity database, is in fact the site is the post-colonial census that the independent Pakistani state started. So as I came across archival documents about census planning in Pakistan this past summer while I was doing follow-up research, I began to follow the kinds of things they were interested in, the officials planning the census, in measuring for the independent census and the political motivations behind this. So I believe that the post-colonial census, perhaps somewhat counterintuitively, provides yet another angle from which to understand Pakistan's shift away from extant forms of classifying identity towards this need to craft a new informational force to meet governance needs. Moreover, the history of Pakistan's census, which unfortunately I will only be able to sketch very briefly here, reveals both the difficulties of identifying individuals alongside the social political history of why the individual was becoming increasingly important for the Pakistani state. So in April 1948, the Pakistani government decided to conduct a census primarily due to the upheavals after partition and the resulting massive changes in population. Simultaneously, they decided to make some changes to the census, which made it somewhat distinct from its colonial predecessor. The Interior Ministry explained to the Census Commissioner, for example, that it wouldn't need to collect any data on religious sects such as Shias or Sunnis. They also said that for Hindus in Pakistan, they would limit the information collected to just the difference between caste and scheduled caste. Otherwise, quote, the work would be enormous and of no use to us. So further, for the purpose of the census, names were of no statistical significance. The Census Commissioner proposed that names should only be recorded provisionally to avoid double counting. Instead, the kinds of categories they were interested in included tribal names, a special questionnaire for Afghans, and ultimately, in the 1972 census, the inclusion of mother tongue. The turn to mother tongue, I think, is important because it reflects the preoccupation about language and ethnic politics leading up to the creation of Bangladesh and beyond. And one thing that caught my attention here in the archives was how the census was used during this moment, during this long partition, for managing the displacement of Muslim refugees in Assam and Tripura in particular. So in 1962, in the wake of expulsions of Muslims and an influx of refugees into East Pakistan, the Pakistani High Commissioner to India informed the Cabinet Division in Pakistan that the Indian government was claiming that the displaced persons were in fact East Pakistani in the first place. So to refute these claims, the High Commissioner was looking for demographic information from previous censuses. And by 1964, as Muslim refugees kept arriving from India, from Assam in particular, to the East Pakistan border, Pakistani officials had set up registration at border posts, conducting a census of these refugees on arrival. And this record would serve the purpose of countering future claims from India that these refugees were in reality Pakistanis all along. So to be clear, this information was statistical and it couldn't identify specific individuals. But it could be mobilized to show that the population of the area from prior censuses couldn't possibly have included all of these incoming populations and displaced persons. So these brief instances from prior to the development of a regime of national individuation give us a sense of how the census was reconfigured to serve Pakistan's informational needs at a time when it continued to experience massive upheavals and movements of population. As the Pakistani state dealt with these upheavals of not only incoming refugees, but ultimately 1971 and the Civil War, the shortcomings of its informational systems were only too clear, ultimately leading the way to an infrastructure for national individuation. So for this last part of the talk, I want to take a step back and say that there are at least two ways that we can read this shift towards individuation in the new informational regime in post-colonial Pakistan. One is that the ideas of what constituted society changed under the newly independent government, for the state at least, where the kinds of classificatory categories that were once salient, most prominently caste, shifted, and in their place the trackable, nationalized individual as a governable political subject gained salience. Second, and not mutually exclusive from the first, such a shift indicates a transformation, I think, in how the state understood and approached the relationship between the individual and social structure in South Asia. Now, this involves revisiting how we have understood kinship as an organizing structure for society. And I hope that you'll bear with me for a second as I delve into a bit of the nitty-gritty of kinship studies, not for its own sake, but for considering how this has been central to the study of Indian society, and in fact governance too, I would argue. So for the colonial state, caste was key for understanding inscrutable Indians, and kinship served as a tool for unlocking this underlying structure. So for the post-colonial state, I would argue kinship becomes a means, a miniaturized code of sorts for apprehending the individual as a node within a network of blood relations, not always as a means to get at these classifiable identities. So disentangling the operations of kinship from the production of caste analytically is then crucial for grasping precisely how the Pakistani state individuated away from the colonial state's mode of classifying identity. Now, I want to clarify and say I'm not saying that caste and kinship have nothing to do with one another. That would be absurd. Of course, social and biological reproduction is made possible through kinship practices, most importantly endogamous marriage, which is what then allows for caste structures to perpetuate. But what I am asking is, where do kinship and caste as organizing structures of society intersect, diverge, and how has their interconnection actually been a historical process? And what I want to foreground here is how kinship structures produce hierarchy and social stratification in more than one way, which the state then relies upon for its own functioning. And kin-based social structures are not one and the same as caste hierarchy. So a classic ethnographic case might be helpful, and again, I hope the non-anthropologists forgive me. So Frederick Barth, in his canonical work on Sawat Pashtuns, attempts to square this kinship caste circle, but is left, unsurprisingly, with some significant gaps. He explains that the pattern of caste endogamy, which is caste intermarriage, is vital where rights and status are transmitted to children from both their parents. But in the Pashtun case, where membership in the descent group, Khel, is passed from father to son through the patriline, matrilineal kinship is seemingly irrelevant to status and authority. But even beyond endogamy, Barth's ethnography raises the question of how to characterize caste in communities and regions where kinship cuts across, producing multiple kinds of hierarchies that don't neatly map onto caste. And most importantly, all of this highlights both the empirical and conceptual difficulties in squaring these caste structures with kinship models. Now, why does this matter to our discussion of how the individual was made in Pakistan? I think because the overwhelming focus on kinship's structural role in producing caste identity has in fact obscured its other functions, precisely in its role of generating the individual. And it's for this reason that I push for a careful analytical separation of kinship from caste without the jettisoning of either. For me, this has involved taking a closer look at what happened at the level of internal kinship structures, at the level of the family, and their recruitment by powerful social and political actors, especially including the state. And this requires also being attentive to the dynamic structures of kinship. Earlier, the notion of kinship was recruited into governance through the enumeration or recording of classified identity, producing not an individual, but a type of person. And this was characterized according to their kinship structure or identifiable unit, so caste or tribe. In the post-colonial period, kinship came to be recruited as an individuating force. And it's in this sense what Henry Maine saw as the transhistorical Indian patriarchal family, central to this production of a timeless Indian society, comes to be flipped on its head. When it comes to kinship being a tool for producing identity, it's not continuity that we see here, but disjuncture. And Nadra's mode of reckoning kinship as a way of establishing individual citizen identity involves deploying what anthropologists call bilateral kinship. So this means that Nadra charts the kin ties of women, in particular, through both their consanguineous and affinal relations. So both the family they marry into and that they were born into. And it does so for all individuals. And so what this means is that kin networks are not based on the model of male agnatic descent, which was central to the patriarchal structures that gave the Indian village its purported stability, but it produces a cognatic kinship. I don't mean to say that all patriarchy is undone by a national identity database. That would be absurd. But the database effectively maintains the patriarchal family by demanding marital linkages as one of the central nodes in its web of relations. This does mean, though, that the construction of individual identity demanded a significant change in reckoning kinship bilaterally by the state, which is something that classificatory forms like the census, of course, did not do. So instead of kinship being a way to access classifiable identity, which in the case of South Asia has always translated to caste, it became a means specifically for the post-colonial state to locate the individual within its family. In other words, it was not the specificity of a given type of kinship system, but the generality of kinship as a system of abstracted blood-based signs that then the meaning of citizenship could be attached to that gave kinship its informational force in the post-colonial period. So to conclude, historians of South Asia, particularly focusing on instruments such as the census, have long emphasized the centrality of classification to colonial logics and the shaping of identity, primarily along the axes of race, caste, and religion in South Asia. And I build on this work, but I want to move it in a different direction by focusing on information technologies directed at making uniquely identifiable individuals. I trace how individuation is connected to, but also departs from these classificatory instruments that produce identity categories. This relationship and this distinction between individuation and classification, I argue, is crucial for how we understand processes of making and maintaining difference, the construction of selves, and ultimately the role of power through information infrastructures in our lives today. Thank you.
My mic is... I think you can hear me, right? Yeah. Now for something entirely different. I should warn you, I am not a historian, and I was just telling Professor Samidar earlier that I am transgressing here purposefully, though, with intent, and hopefully with some mutual takeaways for both sides, because I've never been able to really commit myself to history, and I do think, though, that this moment when Zehra and I were discussing, and I thought, if she leads on sort of with some of the ground work of 1970s South Asia, beginning with Pakistan, I could then probably do a follow-up act and sound reasonably informed to say something about India and the side of things. And I do think technology as lends itself very nicely to interrogating claims about variety of things that do not always appear together. For example, in my talk, I am referring to democracy. Even some of the most incisive observers of South Asia would distinguish between India and Pakistan, at least on this topic. And there is this even an urge, even someone like Sudipta Kaviraj in his lament about potential decline of democracy in India would nonetheless at some point say we had this difference with our neighbor, which was founded on a very distinct state, and its foundational principles varied from our pluralist conception. So I do feel that there is a liberal slippage somewhere when we come to distinguish between these two states and societies and so my effort would be to actually begin this conversation around with some hard facts. And there are some really interesting data that has been released and has been widely publicized, I must say, in India. For one of the reasons for showing this graph is because it would be almost a subject of a news headline and a nightly debate if this was to be put out on, let's say, a front page of a newspaper, because it shows something very interesting, that even on the most basic account of democracy, which is elections, and the electoral democracy index includes much more. I mean, it's based on this framework of polyarchy and how, political competition is organized. It seems there is a convergence. And this is a bit puzzling for all the liberal articulation of the difference between the two states and their social political realities. If they are indeed converging in 2020, what is it telling us? And how do we then read this? So I'm coming not from history. I teach broadly in this domain of governance. And my project here has been evolving as I write my various strands of research. As you mentioned, I have worked on digital politics. I've also worked on data and its sort of political economy. And I'm trying to basically read this differently from how it's being read almost universally as a story of decline. And backsliding is the word that technically we are using, because apparently there is a slide and you could go up and down. And this is really baffling for a history person, I assume, because things go cyclically or they repeat themselves. So if you're backsliding, do you come back to an original position at the end, or does it lead you to abyss? I mean, I'm just throwing out these concepts, which are for historians to deal with. How have we thought about democracy? So I would go a little bit in that direction. And also, as a person who's been to Pakistan, and it was very, very coincidental. I just happened to be, I was a journalist, and I was told there's this study tour you could do where you could watch the other side, in person. And it just so happened that the day or the week I landed in 2007 November as a journalist for CNN, which is a very liberal outlet, and in India was peaks. If you see, 2007 is a very interesting year. Is where if you were to go, that's the broadest. That's when the convergence hasn't really begun. It's coming up. And the week I landed there, it so happened that General Musharraf, who was the dictator, declared martial law. And so I was assuming, well, now it's going to be all dark sirens, tanks on the road, and whatnot, and I should prepare myself to be, because this is the story that's been told. And well, our phones and mobile phones just continued to function. I could receive calls. I could check online. I could blog. And I did write a blog. And in fact, today, the original plan included some of that. I actually recorded, interviewed people to ask them what did they make of, this kind of emergency. That was technically the word they used. But my experience told me there's something we are missing if we were to look at it as information lockdown. In fact, there was a very interesting gadget that also appeared on the social evolution of these generations of mobile telephony, and it was the BlackBerry phone. And if you remember, it was one of the first gadgets that you could communicate using the internet with. And almost everybody in Pakistan of any sort of political consequence had one. And I was just struck by how nobody paid attention. The news channels, which, if you remember, were actually encouraged during the Musharraf era, and most of the big news media, like in India, in Pakistan, were emerged in the 90s and were sort of these rival entities, and people would often have headline wars, which, if you watch any of the news channels in India, Pakistan, continue tonight, till today. So there would be these different headlines, the same event, two different versions debated, and often recruiting the same expert analysts. They were put under, so the people who were criticizing the regime would be, there was a blackout, and there would be a black band. If you were to switch on the Geo News, there would be a black band, and Faiz Ahmad Faiz's bowl would become, a very resonant slogan among my sort of, media friends. And there were marches, but more or less, there was no information blockade, as I would expect it. And so that has made me think about what is it that we classify as democracy and what is its relation to information access. And I do think we have fallen in some sort of a conceptual trap. I did refer earlier that even those kind of mourning or lamenting what's perhaps happening in India would be a little critical in comparing it to Pakistan. But I think there are theories that do take information access and hierarchies of access very seriously in explaining democracy. And I think there's a broad literature in comparative politics, for example, which focuses on information as a resource that can be commanded and then used to mystify the public and misinform, or, this whole effect, information effect theories, and the idea that there are now not just liberal regimes, not just autocratic regimes don't need to really blockade information. They could use it to create confusion, and spin dictators being a very new conceptual framing of this. As well as there are some cultural theories, post-colonial theory in particular, but also more popular writing about democracy being in decline because there has been this backlash from local or from below, because this was too much of an elite liberal project, and this writing, even in the context of technology, that there is the cost of connection has been too high for too many people who now feel dissatisfied, and hence this is fueling an illiberal cultural backlash. I wasn't convinced by either two entirely, because the realities on ground are quite significantly distinct. I mean, the places that vote, for example, for parties or leaders who would be seen as autocratic don't necessarily have the highest rates of information access, or have been the most badly bad losers in this globalization game, if you were to look at it that way. And there's in fact some very interesting work being done around the impact of what has been called the liberal order, of which the internet, the information explosion, the new economy, the knowledge economy, all of that has been seen to have bad impact even on developed industrial advanced capitalist societies like US. So there is ideas of weaponized interdependency that because the US believed that it could privatize its information infrastructure and let it run amok in the world, it would somehow benefit. In fact, what ended up happening was that a lot of autocratic societies learned how to use these channels and flood in the information or disinformation, and this foreign impact on elections really triggered that research and that conceptual framing of weaponized interdependencies. There's also this additional argument that because the standards were market-driven, autocratic states could compete or outcompete capitalist states and essentially set the standards that suited their needs. So on both fronts, in fact, it's not entirely convincing to say that the democracy backsliding or decline has come only to those places which have had a cultural, they've been the losers or they've had a backlash, and that's fueling this backlash. I think we need some conceptual clarity, and also to say something more about democracy than it's often portrayed in sort of liberal theory. So I would begin from this sort of thing. And my main argument, which has emerged, is that rather than sort of critique it entirely as, from a lens of cultural difference or relativism, perhaps the concepts that we need to take technology in relative terms. And this is a slightly complex formulation. I'll come back to it. But basically, what I want to say is that as much as I appreciate VDEMS, which is the original data about democracy that's making headlines, comparing, and in VDEM you could punch in different states and compare democratic trajectories. And almost universally you will see them rise. Like there's never been, in fact, Francis Fukuyama, who kind of the iconic liberal theorist of democracy, says, well, it's not really democracy that's on decline, that's liberalism that has failed in some parts of the world. And they are accommodating all this within the overall graph, which is on the rise. So more states do host elections. There's no, there's no doubt around that. But I think the real debate has come down to what does democracy mean? For some, is it elections, and then there is quality of democracy debate, which concerns, well, is there an agreement among people? Polarization shouldn't be that high that it just breaks into kind of a complete free-for-all. There are these rule of law issues, and all of those things have come back. So I think we are in a moment where we are rethinking what is the conceptual value of using the word democracy. My focus, because it's been on technology, I do think, and I do refer here to Kaviraj, who says that, if we are to do political theory of democracy, we must pay attention to ordinary processes. We shouldn't really just focus on the big institutions and the language of being sort of this kind of alienating conceptual terrain for most people. So if we are to do that, then we have to pay attention to what's going on, which is one of the continuous changes that have happened in this course of backsliding or peaking and then falling is the expansion of technology. And in fact, I think the 1970s is a very peculiar moment, because if you were to read even contemporary popular writings on information era, it traces back to something around there. And you would find the big corporate entities that are associated with information economy emerging around that time, but also discussions in political science, quantitatively mapping trends across the world really were fine-tuned in the 1970s. I, however, think that there was more going on in that moment. And I'll just walk us through what I think could be an alternative reading of the history of the internet. And this takes me back to the debates when actually there was no digital, and that's the common theme, I think, in this presentation. There are these prehistories that precede the digital. Not that computation and binary digital work was not taking off, but the real debate in the 1970s was about the emergence of transnational satellite networks, which was huge because you could now transfer data, information, broadcasting, all of this really took off in that era. And there was a real significant debate, hosted partly at the UN, where these recently decolonized states claimed their stake and said, well, we need to have access to the resources, and we could develop our own satellite program. Some very small island nations became very significant because they could be used as launch pads, and geostationary satellite launch often needs kind of very specific requirements if you were to, and so who owns the rights to space became a big question. More importantly, I think it became about what sort of mechanism would be used to distribute these resources, and what sort of mechanism would be used to regulate the flow of information. And the doctrine from the dominant powers at the time was free flow of information, and that was entirely for strategic reasons. So, in fact, in the US, the doctrine of free flow of information was being contested because Herbert Schiller, who's, you know much better about his work, was saying, well, information ownership in US is actually becoming very concentrated within a very few supply, and the local news is dying, and you have corporatization. None of that actually played out internationally. Very few people paid attention that during the same time that US burgeoned, the opposition internationally on this issue and said, no, there should not be any restrictions. Let markets just determine, what is information, where should it flow, who should own it. And all of that really was, contrasted with this alternative model, which was obviously in the Cold War era, the antagonist, the Soviet-Russian model, which was extremely paranoid about all of this for very different reasons. They saw it as a problem of control. Censorship was ideological. It was not something that you had to do as a bad thing. It was something needed for the progress of everybody. So it was genuinely argued in those terms. And Cuba becomes a very interesting, kind of state, which kind of still continues to advocate for this very interesting version of the internet regulation. And Pakistan, I haven't really paid attention, but India for sure wasn't really on either of the two sides. And one of the things was, that you would need to have some sort of redistribution globally, and the richer powers must pay some amount for what infrastructure gets built in states like India and Pakistan. And there was a very serious debate. I've referred here as NUECO, which is New World Information and Communication Order. I think between these two big models, and I think the liberal model clearly won out because we did get decentralized market-based infrastructure, which is what internet sort of default mode is. It's also corporate-led innovation, and so no regulation there, please. And of course, individual consent and choice being the normative supporting basis for it. And it kind of then dovetails very well with democracy, because you see now choice should extend and information is kind of something you choose to do. But I think there was something lost in this debate, which was these alternative ideas, which did get some resonance in the non-alignment movement, for example, non-aligned movement. They were ideas about how information provision should be aligned to developmental goals, information regulation should be sort of, a regulatory structure should command it, not just market-based model. There were, in fact, innovations that were not corporate-led, and this remains, I would argue, a kind of an alternative even today, and I will come back to this, that if we are to say that today's challenge is big tech, then the solution is not to sort of say, well, it's this or nothing. There have been these long in the making alternatives, as well as there could be regulatory checks on big tech. And all of this has had a long history. And it may not qualify as the internet, but these models do persist in many parts of the world. In fact, when I went to Pakistan and everyone was saying, well, when I was interviewing these bloggers, I clearly remember they said, we're going to take on the power through internet. And I said, well, where is the basis for this in society? Because I come from India and we have an IT sector. And we have South India, which has produced pioneering IT, and has generated huge amounts of revenue. Pakistan, essentially North India, there is no peninsula with all the IT hubs. How are you going to build a movement online if you don't really have the social economic basis for nurturing that? And I was underestimating some trends that would really define it. And so if we are to think that we do confront a big tech moment, how are we going to think about it? Could very well be understood if we pay more attention to what actually happens in democracies like India. So I'm not going to say, well, let's go back to history and sort of take historical lessons. I think it has played out. And it has played out in the very making of the internet. The success of liberal order has fueled a certain kind of reaction which needs to be mapped out. So I have three sort of broad trends that I think have shaped the internet as we know it in India or in the global south, if you like. The first is that technology has not really followed the vision of Cold War rhetoric. It's followed the money trail. So if you see Silicon Valley really is the innovator, and for a very simple reason, it's very unregulated as against any other sector. It has had much more risk-taking, and this week is a very interesting moment to talk about Silicon Valley financial backing of technology startups worldwide. I don't need to say why, but it has clearly been a very pivotal reason for why internet succeeded. You take that out and you would not see this as the dominant paradigm for technology today. And in fact, I think it has been in some sort of crisis since the financial crisis of 2008. And I personally tracked a lot of venture capital investment fora in India. And you could literally, read about them more in Financial Times than in Indian newspapers because they're completely transnational entities. There's a very nice phrase of bubble capitalism. There are these spheres of hyper-capitalism which have nothing to do with their neighborhoods. And I think in India, Bangalore certainly has that vibe that you are in a California time zone. It's really not the IST that is at work here. Things move in a certain to a different order, and people do tend to follow trends that are in, Palo Alto than in Koramangala, which is in South Indian area, and then the state of Karnataka has a very different rural context, and then there is this kind of financial hub, which has a completely different feel, and that has really fueled some of our IT. So my big argument, if I were to have in Pakistan, was like, no, we've got all this IT base, and so we will be the internet kind of democracy. And that just doesn't work like that. The other thing that I sort of track very closely is the actual technologists, and I work in an institute of technology, and most of my students get recruited by so-called big tech, right? So they would come and they'll say, well, H-1B is your ticket to global startup world. And the migration that started in the 70s gradually started to peak. But it's only been in the last 10 to 15 years that it's really exploded. If you see the IT story in the US, 60% of IP, the intellectual property that drives the startup world of innovation, because it's essentially IP meets commercialization, that's the model, 60% is by immigrants. In fact, most recently, if you see, the Tesla's overwhelming firing of its sort of staff, there's a clear understanding that people who would come from outside would deliver this much better. So there is this story of Indian migration of highly skilled engineers to the US and eventually arriving at the corporate leadership level. So almost all the big tech now has names which sound familiar to anybody in South Asia and are often evoked in the discussions about India's digital future. And so really, if big tech is to be tackled, then it's partly an Indian story in this way as well. So besides money, there's migration. And then the kind of crucial link to democracy would be much more directly with the story of the media development, which I was part of for a while, and I have tracked very closely. It tracks very closely with the story of the financial capitalism and the migration story. And there is almost you could see the media story and India's democracy story evolving with these trends in the political economy of innovation and the kind of digitalization that's happened. And that really has also changed dramatically since 2008. I mean, if you really pay attention behind the rhetoric of those evening, nightly India-Pakistan headline wars that happen, Republic Television, for example, the initial investors are not from Delhi. So it might seem like a regime, pro-regime voice, but it's clearly funded by the same people who would fund essentially a venture capitalist cohort that would fund now national media, and is directly invested in it. The founder of the channel, in fact, is the Minister for State now. He's disinvested himself from that media network and has aligned himself much more closely with the regime. So there's a constant revolving door between media, tech investor circles, Californian innovation ecosystem, as it's sometimes called. And there are alternatives that continue. For example, if you were to go and log into an IIT's internet, you would not be using anything close to privately organized tech services. In fact, it would be state-sponsored, and there are these parallel networks with very interesting technological capacities, but also very interesting and delinked from financial and innovation startup sort of capital. They are managed often by public agencies, ERNet, and now NKN, which is the National Knowledge Commission. They tend to then operate on a parallel track. And I think what I want to basically get at is that even as big tech has kind of emerged, it's largely you can say, come apart from the story of democracy. It has largely been only in the last 10, 12 years that it has become what it has become, and it has not played the role that it would, that the Cold War rhetoric about technological innovation was as envisioned. And I think BlackBerry is a very good metaphor for it, because within 3 or 4 years, the company just went out of business. It could not compete in this new era of financially, profligate technology, innovation-driven ecosystem. There is no Nokia. There's none of that initial technology, which I think was some of the basis for the liberal conceptions of linkage between technology and democracy. I think they have, in fact, faded away. And what you do have now is a kind of new political economy with very complex interdependencies. And I do not think we could ignore this if we are to think about how technology and democracy, in fact, interact. There is, it's a long, I'm rushing through it, but largely what I would argue is that while there is this backlash, it's certainly not been from below. It has its origins in the making of the global sort of financial capital-driven innovation. And in fact, my current work is on sort of mapping innovation strategies adopted within Indian regions. And I just want to quickly end with a recent survey that was done. Where do you think the support for illiberal politics really lies? It's not amongst the disconnected. It's not amongst those who don't have access. And there isn't that kind of basis for it. In fact, there was a survey and they asked people, are you aware that there is surveillance online? And so really a big tech question. And so you would assume that there would be kind of an anger amongst those who use it. And this is not the only time it's been revealed, but it has been the case that people who tend to use social media are not only well aware of it, and there is net support for some kind of government intervention. And that trend really reflects for me a disjuncture between technology and democracy. And I think the only alternative to big tech would have to be, because there can't be no tech world. I think we've gone long past that, and it has tied itself into all these strategic domains, so there is no return to a 1970s, let's start again moment. But I think we have to invent what I've started to call mid-tech, which is not big tech, and it has scope for democracy, not that big tech would not be. And I think it's not by default that this is happening, it's by design. And it's not by some coincidence that Pakistan and India have started to merge precisely in those years when, and you could look for VDEM's measures of internet use, and the graphs are just stark. And it's not for no reason that these two convergences begin from the moment of financial big tech kind of bubble building, 2008. Before that, I think there is no obvious convergence, but it does begin around that time, and we are seeing, in a sense, a moment where, the real driver is that the story I just told about technology, rather than this cultural backlash, which is a very, I think, could mislead us into thinking about democracy in terms that are disjointed from the wider development of capitalism and technology. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll just do a brief introduction to people who are going to read these papers, and then we'll open up for a wider conversation. So Dwarpan Banerjee is an associate professor of science, technology, and society at MIT, and although he's written a couple of books before, perhaps the most relevant would be his current project, which is on decolonizing science, cosmopolitics of art, physics, and computing in 1950s India, thinking with both information technologies as well as aesthetics. So I'm curious to hear your response to the conversation here. And Russell Newman, who's an associate professor at Emerson College and author of The Paradoxes of Network Neutrality, is perhaps the most significant text here, maybe came up earlier in Aasim's thinking with, which really looks at the US and debates on broadband non-discrimination and the ways in which it has engendered also political conversation and struggles around what might be called surveillance capitalism, a term I think good to put on the table for our discussion here today. So I don't know who wants to go first.
Should I go first? Respond to the audio, I guess.
Responding. And
thank you for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation, and Zehra for thinking of me to talk about this. So it's a real privilege to be here to think alongside Zehra's work. Her talk on Pakistan's National Database and Registration Authority, or NADRA, raises obviously several fascinating insights. I'll try to distill some of the key insights as I see it, and then pose some brief questions towards the end. So over the last 2 decades, social scientists across a range of disciplines have raised alarms about the growing power of governments across the world to surveil its citizens, backed by new computational and biometric identification technologies. And as many of you are aware, here in the United States, much of this discussion focuses on the question of individual privacy and the rights of citizens to safeguard their own data. And of course, this work has been vital to protecting civil liberties in our increasingly digitized worlds. But Hashmi's work here is a crucial reminder of something that is often missed in this framing. While some national databases have indeed come to surveil and store large quantities of biometric data, in the end, as social artifacts themselves, they ingest, encode, and work with deeply social forms of relatedness. So to my mind, this is why the Nadra case is so truly revelatory, perhaps not just for Pakistan, but for thinking more broadly about databasing. Rather than envelop itself in the hype of biometrics and large storage capacities, the architects of Nadra openly acknowledge and indeed celebrate the fact that Nadra is fundamentally dependent on mapping social relations. As Hashmi shows, Nadra does not essentially depend on biometrics to identify individuals, as much as it depends on capturing the kinship relations within which an individual can be located. To me, this in itself is a game-changing revelation. Often the explicit promise of national databases, why do they get created, is that they can abstract individuals away from the messiness of their social context, establishing a single juridical personhood in place of messy collective social identities. For example, with Aadhaar, many of you will have heard, one of the key justifications is to get directly to the individual via the body, get rid of the corrupt social world within which they're placed. So often then, as a result, both supporters and opponents of national databases all across the world have fixated on biometrics as the key new thing to celebrate or change, depending on your politics. Hashmi's work reveals a central hidden paradox that is buried in this debate. At the end of the day, despite all the global hype about biometrics, one of the largest databases in the world continues to rely on social relatedness to identify individuals. So to me, this is one of the first of many powerful insights of Hashmi's work, that social relations are not erased as they might seem to be, but are in fact fundamentally vital to the working of new digital information regimes. And this is where things get really interesting. If we set aside the hype about new technologies and biometrics, Nadra, as Hashmi shows, begins to resemble older state forms of state projects of classification and enumeration. And as the audience is obviously aware, from the late colonial period, practices of collecting national data in the form of colonial censuses and surveys has always been a matter of some controversy. Part of this controversy has been about the harms and benefits of marking out people through the fraud categories of caste and ethnicity, whether this reinforces in some way, and so on. This is a long historical debate. This leads Hashmi to ask, if Nadra as a database is fundamentally socially relational, then how does it relate to these kinds of previous infrastructures with similarly sampled social relatedness? Her historically informed answer is that databasing technologies, both old and new, are the outcomes of historically specific political anxieties. The first historical formation Hashmi analyzes is the late colonial state and its project of classifying populations through its censuses. Certainly, at one level of abstraction, there are continuities between the colonial and contemporary states' desire to establish power through a systematic knowledge of the population it governs. But Hashmi makes a wonderful counterintuitive move here. Rather than find a simple continuity between the colonial and post-colonial states' practices, as less historically minded anthropologists might often do, Hashmi stresses their differences. So to elaborate, if the colonial state thought of caste as the key to unlocking the mysteries of its population, the contemporary state takes kinship as its central principle. And of course, Hashmi reiterates, caste and kinship have always been interlinked in South Asia, particularly through practice of endogamy, and as Durga Mitra's work on forced endogamy shows, that interlinking is also historically contingent. But Hashmi persuasively shows how the contemporary state operationalizes kinship not to get to caste groupings, but rather to individual identifications. To me, while this might feel like a minor modification, I think it is in fact a tectonic shift in state policy. The census as it records caste is fundamentally a procedure of classification and does not allow for individual identification. The contemporary state's procedures of tracking kinship, on the other hand, work particularly well to isolate individuals within their kin networks. So that's why the colonial states' practices of classification have drawn the most historical attention. What do we do when they do not really offer a satisfying template to pass Nadra's logic, which seems to be a significant departure from that mode of historical power? This leads to Hashmi's next fascinating insight. To understand Nadra's genealogy requires not only putting aside the colonial state, but disaggregating the histories of the post-colonial state. Each post-colonial moment reveals a different set of political anxieties and new desires for information. First, she documents how the 1948 government responded to the massive population-level changes brought about by partition by centering language rather than caste as a key marker. In this way, the census was reconfigured from its colonial avatar to serve the early post-colonial government's particular needs. Importantly, Hashmi shows how this identificatory regime was more similar to the colonial state than it is with Nadra. Both worked at the level of group identities that refused to take naming as its basis of individuation. Hashmi then goes on to trace a second major post-colonial shift, the manual identity card regime launched in the early 1970s. This, she shows, is Nadra's closest historical predecessor. While still pre-digital, this regime dreamt for the first time of recording every individual identity within its borders. In the aftermath of the 1971 war and with heightened Cold War anxieties about Afghan foreigners, the Pakistani state needed to make more and more granular distinctions about who counted as a Pakistani citizen. Group identities then, of course, would no longer do, since specific enemies had to be found and targeted. To me, Hashmi's disaggregation in this way of post-colonial history thus becomes an impressive and important move. It would have been easy for her to generalize the contemporary will to surveillance back to colonial power. It would have been equally easy for her to generalize the post-colonial as marking the birth of a new kind of state power. The felicity of Hashmi's ethnohistorical analysis is that she rejects both these options, offering a more granular history of the post-colonial and how particular political shifts within its years gave birth to new regimes of very different kinds of individuated identification. This point is important not only to scholars of South Asia, but to historians of technology more generally. The explosion of computing infrastructures has certainly afforded the contemporary state and states across the world new powers of national identification, but to get lost in the hype of biometrics and computational power would miss this point. As Hashmi shows, while new identification databases might cloak themselves in such hype, understanding their underlying logics requires looking backwards rather than forwards. In the case of Pakistan, this means looking back to 5 decades of well-honed political strategies to manage very particular and historically contingent regional anxieties. So these are only a few of Hashmi's many insights worth remarking upon, but in the interest of time, let me shift gears and pose a few questions that came to my mind while reading this paper. So the first question is, how much of this is really a South Asia story? Or in other words, how does this analysis of Nadra scale outside the subcontinent? I ask this because, as you know, South Asia has always occupied a peculiar place in thinking about the political stakes of social relatedness. You already brought up thinking about Morgan and Maine. To kind of elaborate that a little bit, that in influential colonial era social theorists of kinship and politics took South Asia as exemplary of evolutionarily backward form of political organization because it was based on kinship rather than on legal contract. In other words, according to this story, political life in South Asia was pre-modern because it was based on ascribed group identities, whereas advanced societies had moved on to more modern contractual-based forms of citizenship. Now, I bring this scholarship up because it runs against the grain of Hashmi's description of Nadra. With Nadra, we see how kinship is in fact vital to the making of modern legal and contractual personhood in Pakistan. And one way to read this would be to just say, okay, South Asia is still contaminated by pre-modern forms of social organization that stand in the way of political modernity. Another way, and which I think Hashmi suggests and is much more compelling, is to think of how forms of social relatedness are a feature, not a bug of identificatory regimes, more generally, not just in South Asia, but elsewhere in the world. In other words, I wonder whether Hashmi's demonstration of old forms of social relatedness underneath seemingly new modern information infrastructures teaches us something more generally about the limits of technological hype. And this comes up in the US all the time when people talk about facial recognition and how that affects marginalized populations minoritized by race and gender. There's always this surprise of, how are these old forms of social relations coming up again in these ways of identifying that are based so much on particular forms of biological features. That confusion seems here to be endemic rather than an accident. So shifting the conversation away from biometrics, does the Nadra case tell us something more general about the insistent presence of social relatedness in the newest of most shiny information regimes? Second, what exactly has computerization and digitization enabled in the present Pakistani context? While describing the 1970s, you talk about the pre-digital dreams of computational power and how the desire for computational power was built into the design of the paper registry from the very outset. This, in one sense, was really interesting to me because the computational power existed, and because I look at the history of computing in India, through a complex set of geopolitical interventions, the mid-1960s, the US actually affords India exactly this kind of computational power as a kind of reversal of its older technological mindset. So the technologies exist, but it's, housed in Calcutta and Bombay. So I wonder what's going on there geopolitically. But also, I also appreciate the move here that you make, and this is what historians of technology are very happy with, that you do not take the analog as separate from the digital, but trace a continuity of political practices that the second gives birth to from the first. At the same time, it does sound like some of the desires for deduplicating identities were in fact frustrated by the annual paper machine. So if that's true, what new opportunities for individuation does computerization open up? So now I'm saying maybe there is something new here. And how do these new opportunities go beyond just deduplication, which is just the most basic kind of thing to do, obviously. And now I'm thinking about the linking of databases. I finally gave in and got my Aadhaar card because it wasn't possible to get a phone connection or my bank, but none of that was supposed to be how it was supposed to be. But now that these databases are so linked, private-public partnerships are indiscernibly amalgamated, this kind of brings me back to that important distinction you make between classification and identification. Because I'm thinking here of how the linking of computerized databases can actually now amplify what was supposed to be an individuating project into a new classificatory regime. So with this kind of new database infrastructures, does the classification and individuation distinction really hold up? I think you're always saying it's historically in relation. I think you're suggesting that there's a move towards individuation since 73. I'm wondering in the post-2000 whatever moment, if there's another kind of synergy happening now. And my last question, which might be outside this workshop's concerns more as an anthropologist, and I can't help but say this, is how much I enjoyed the opening passage, the ethnographic kind of rupture that occurs in this kinship moment and that kind of enters but does not enter the database in certain ways. How do you think of the relation between kinship as this sort of lived experience and the way it kind of is encoded into databases? And of course, there seem to be at least two ways. One way would be to argue that these lived experiences are flattened when they're databased, that the complexities are reduced to simple mappings. But another, and I think more compelling STS sort of view would be to ask how the lived experiences of kinship shape these databases and then are in turn shaped by the databasing as a new political strategy. Okay, I'll stop here for now. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
That's a lot, but I think we'll have Russell comment and then let you go through some.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, and thank you very much for having me today. And if Aasim thought he was taking us into the nether regions, I'm about to take us to Mars, I suppose. I'm probably the true weirdo on this panel. So my background is really in media policy and political economy, something that we certainly call a field as opposed to your discipline here in anthropology. But my time in the academy, preceding my time in the academy, I was an activist working on broadband policy and more here in the US. There is a tie to all these things, I promise. But tech policy does three things, or at least this is what I believed it did. Back when I was doing this. One, it determines who has access to means of communication. Two, it determines what you can access, and it kind of determines what you're able to do over these means of communication. And that was at least what I thought back then, but something that is very clear now is that any discussion of tech policy inevitably, just because of how big tech is in terms of market capitalization in the US, any move you make to write new privacy law, any move you make to try, as our FTC is right now, to perhaps rein in concentration and more, has much bigger implications than just on that media itself. You're affecting US and arguably global economies in the process. And a piece that really occurred to me in listening to these presentations that I really like to use with my students, it's a classic piece that Raymond Williams wrote back in the 1970s, the introduction to television, technology, and cultural form. And it's one of these wonderful chapters where you can take the word television out of the title and just replace it with anything. It could be a modem, it could be a garlic grater. Whatever it is, whatever you think is earth-shattering to you, you can replace it. And his intonations about method remain true, where he's resisting narratives of technological determinism, which is a familiar thing to most of us these days, but also resisting narratives that say a particular technology is itself symptomatic. It would have to be this way if it didn't exist otherwise. One and the same time, and trying to restore a notion of intentionality to how we go about studying these things. And part of the wonderful sensation I get in listening to these two really fascinating presentations is a drive to try to get at exactly this kind of intentionality, where we're thinking specifically about what decisions got made in the production of a particular technology. Williams was talking about television, he was talking about material things, he was putting this in a context of a growing industrial capitalism, but frankly, you can expand upon this and think of it as the intentional growth of institutions, and something that just my own work in studying decades of telecom policy in the US, and I do promise to tie it to what they were talking about here, but my own studies of telecom policy in the US, what I found as an activist is that we were having the same debates over and over and over again. And what one finds when you're having the same debates over and over, when you're boxed into a corner where big tech might be arguing something and you're trying to argue something back, you might have made your point a million times. The real solution to the conundrum is maybe there's not an answer between the two of you. You have to go more meta. And what we really found in the US is tech policy riding on the coattails of a broader move, a epistemological move that has gone under the rubric of neoliberalization, where it's a questioning of, can humans be trusted to plan? Right? Can humans be trusted to plan? The neoliberals in the 1940s and 1950s and so forth, they were battling two things. One were socialists, the other was complete laissez-faire capitalism. And they came down in a place where they said, we need to design a system, and this is a series of debates. It's not a doctrinaire thing. We're going to have debates around this. We need to design markets because we can't trust humans to plan. But when we're thinking about how we conceptualize democracy, they do use democracy. The role of democracy is to legitimate particular decisions that ironically get made by an elite. You need markets, but someone's going to have to design those markets, right? Bringing this to the present. Listening to your presentation about this drive to both the intersections between classification and individuation. You see a government identification scheme. I see a million corporate YouTube videos by companies like Tapad that are analyzing kinship networks in the form of roommate connections and more, while also trying to figure out the patterns of their use so that one can individually target them. Now we're moving it to a point where companies like Apple and Google are sitting back and saying, we all know you don't trust the third-party cookies anymore, so we're going to protect you all, effectively consolidating their control over a pretty massive resource, with identification remaining as the goal. And the value what I find so interesting, what I'm so glad to be here, is in the kind of thinking that you're doing about your epoch. There's a lot of theory building we need to do in the political economic space to think through the deliberate decisions, the intentionalities undergirding development of the system that you described. So I think there's a ton that US-based scholars, and in fact EU-based scholars, will learn. I suppose a question for Aasim, and I don't want to suck up too much time to prevent questions from happening across the room, but it is your core quandary where you're trying to think through this thing, democracy. It is truly fraught, particularly because in network neutrality debates, about which I wrote, by the time we hit the Trump administration, where a frankly radical Federal Communications Commission eliminated non-discrimination rules aboard internet networks here, and at the same time eliminated any privacy you had from your internet service providers, right? We were having ferocious debates. It looks democratic, but actually the debates that were happening had nothing to do with the decisions that were being made in and of themselves. And this was partly intentionally by design and study, and so I was very interested in how we go about thinking through the platform upon which, metaphorically speaking, we do these debates. I suppose I'm seeking clarification about what you're arguing when you say, let's pay attention to the tech when we're considering democracy. And I wonder if there's a possible meta step we can take to say maybe it's not just looking at the tech, but thinking about the tech in relation to the broader intentionalities of the growth of this particular industry and all that it entails, and examine how that platform itself has been constructed and how you can have ferocious debates on that platform about various things, even as the platform is moving inexorably in one particular direction underneath your feet and you're barely even noticing it, yourself. Which is where we get to a place in the US where you have some of the most lax policy protections, put big old scare quotes around what protections we've got, worldwide right now. So I'll leave this here. There's some initial thoughts that came to mind in these marvelous presentations, and I thank you again for having me here.
Thanks.
Do you both want Zehra and then Aasim respond to these comments? And then we'll open up to questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dwight, for reading the whole the longer paper that I sent to us. But yeah, thank you so much for this incredibly close reading. And yeah, all of your questions are actually questions that I've struggled with for a long time. You hit three of the sort of central problems that I've had in a really, really productive way. So I'll speak first, I think, to how much of this is a South Asia story, because I think that's a very, there are two sorts of answers that I can give to that. One is, classically, one is a historical answer, and then the other will be more ethnographically minded response. So the first thing is I took a lot from Keith Breckenridge's The Biometric State in South Africa, because I think it's a really important connection actually with South Asia, because for everyone else in the room, it's a super interesting story where Gandhi basically facilitates. Mariam Ghazala is here and she was in my class and I made them read it. And I'm like, this is the other side of the Gandhi. You don't see the Gandhi in South Africa. So he facilitates the fingerprint registration of Indians in the Transvaal in South Africa. And there, there's all of this backlash and then he goes back on it because he says, oh, this is actually an invasion into the Indian family. And so I think there's ways that we can see, and that's partly why fingerprint registration doesn't happen outside of criminal tribes and criminality and policing in South Asia. So there's actually historical dimension to why it is that systems like Aadhaar and Nadra come later, and that there isn't that kind of systematic individual identification in an earlier period, and has something to do with the experience in South Africa of the colonial state. So I find the historical moment really important, but I also think there's something else that you're saying that I've also thought a lot about with contract versus status, and what is the move here, where something I want to be really careful about is not making it seem like Pakistan is doing this kind of crazy, peculiar thing with kinship, because I do think that there's something much more fundamental with how databases work and how they do identification. So even, not to get extremely formalist about this, but even the way that, the only way that identification can happen, and maybe this goes back to what you're saying with the videos and the networks, is that for Nadra at least, you can only have identity, you can only produce identity if you're connecting at least two things. So this conceit that the individual will emerge in and of itself is a failure.
Through the body.
Or through the body even, yeah. And so I think even with the body and the name is what actually produces the unique identity. But what we're seeing with Aadhaar, and other officials love talking about how much Aadhaar sucks. Yeah, they keep telling you, like, we've done so much of they're a disaster. But part of it is that, relying on biometrics alone will never get you anywhere. And so there is this way that the biometrics are only one piece of this larger puzzle. And we see this in a lot of places with, I think, what you're talking about also with how databases are actually supposed to work. So even for social welfare, which Pakistan does use NADRA for providing income support to women in particular through the Benazir Income Support Program. And so there's that kind of networking, I think, is where that social relatedness is extremely important. And that gets me to the other question that you were asking about, a part of your second question about classification and individuation, where I think you're absolutely right, that there are more interconnections alongside this one that I presented on today. And there are two ways that I think classification reemerges again. Probably more than two, but two that I can think of. One is that through networked databases, so NADRA of course connects to banking, it connects to voting, it connects to all these other things. And so because of how important group identities are in those domains of social and political action, of course it's going to re-enter those conversations. The really concrete way I can point to that, and I write about this in the ethnographic chapters, is that at some point in between 2015 and 2016, it was primarily Pashtuns in Pakistan, tribal Pashtuns, who began to see their identity cards being blocked. And so why would it be that this system that does not ostensibly collect data on ethnicity block Pashtun's cards? So and it's fascinating because actually the chairman at the time came out and said, we're not doing discrimination, we're just catching family intruders. And so they're catching Afghan refugees, catching in quotation marks, Afghan refugees who have quote unquote intruded into Pakistani Pashtun families. But that is one way of actually using relatedness as a way to get to a threatening identity. And I think in neighborhoods, they also recognize this is not supposed to be happening. So they say, well, I'm a Pakistani just like any other. Like, why is this happening to me and people in my neighborhood or in my group? So there are a lot of ways that I think that we can't get away from the politics of classificatory identity. So yeah, there's that piece is happening. Now, what does digitization enable? I think that this experience speaks to that directly because it enables a blocked SIM card. It enables all of you can't vote anymore, you can't buy property anymore. And it's precisely that sort of networking across governance functions that which of course I also want to say, I mean, it's a larger story, but I think in Pakistan it is also very much a post 9/11 story of like why it is that all of these things were put into place. So yeah, there's that kind of digitization, I think, across functions is something that even though we must think of computation beyond the digital, we must think of it as also an analog process that exists outside of specific technological objects. There are things that those objects, like biometric readers and things, enable. The last question you asked about kinship as lived experience, and how that recursive relationship operates has been one of the things I've struggled with most. So in the book project now, I'm trying to think through this concept of datafied kinship and how it is that both exists in the world, in a social world, but also is an abstracted model necessarily of all of the mess of like what actual, see, I fall into it again, but what actual kin relations, lived kin relations are like. But I think one of the ways that I'm beginning to think about it is, how is it that these two forms are constantly interacting? I can see it very clearly in the registration center, like in the example that I shared, where people are bringing in the ways that they actually relate to their family and all of the fraught ways that they relate to their family members into that space, and that's getting encoded into the database. But I also see Nadra, actually, this is something I didn't expect, having a kind of a feedback loop effect into people's lives, where they're affected by the system in a way that seeps into their relationships, where a family member not being able to get an ID card or having an ID card that's blocked actually really affects the way that people in that family are able to function together. So yeah, it's been a hard piece though, and it goes back into that morass of kinship studies of like, what is kinship? Because that's the problem. Like, we cannot come to one definition of what actually constitutes kin. So some of the problem, I think, is also with the kind of analytics we have at hand to describe both of these complex things. But thank you so very, very much for just like how carefully you thought through.
It was a pleasure to read. But also, yeah, formal models of kinship are also sort of computational databases.
Exactly, exactly, yes.
So just quickly, and before that, just to speak back to this discussion on digitization in Pakistan, one of the things you mentioned was the digital census. And if you actually look, the political debate around it is very interesting. It's historically, the census has had an issue with people arguing that they have been undercounted. And when they say, and this would not be fitting with our kind of Colonial perspectives, but right now the leadership in Sindh says that this is going to be even more disastrous because now there's even more chances of us being not counted. And it mirrors some of the debate about India's concerns with using of EVMs for voting, for example. The kind of assumptions that we have about people's agencies on what they expect these technologies to deliver to them is actually quite interesting. The claim making for Aadhaar, there isn't someone there, it's politically not correct perhaps, but there was not, there was never a moment where they said, no, we don't want to give you our data because, privacy issues. No, that happened, for example, when the NRC debate happened, which in fact is related to the citizenship agenda. That's when the question of showing our papers became a problem. So I think some of the framing of the census, for example, as a colonial, really doesn't speak to the practices that happen around census, which very interestingly isn't happening in India for the very first time in its 150 years of conducting this exercise, 1871, through the colonial times, through the post-colonial phase. It's the first decade ever that India is not conducting a census, while Pakistan is conducting a digital census. So much for IT capacities in the state. And I think these are points where we should not, maybe we have to think more in political terms. And to come back to then the political side, the meta questions are where even I have kind of landed eventually, about history's motion, about democracy as what is it really achieving? And I am interested in those questions. I'm less so in the questions of representation and themes that have, I think, been rehearsed endlessly in claiming the largestness of India's democracy. I think there is something to be in the meta sense, and meta has been appropriate also, by technology. There is something to be said about the scale at which we conduct inquiries. And I'm actually very interested in ethnographic studies of technology, and STS has done it exceptionally well. But I do worry sometimes, for example, where is the South Asian history of the BlackBerry, which came and was adopted? Where is the South Asian study of WhatsApp, which is pioneered, I think, in South Asia, maybe invented by mistake in Silicon Valley. But truly, beginning with our use of missed calls to WhatsApp, I think we have pioneered what WhatsApp can deliver. And I think this agency is what I'm very interested, because that's what is mobilized in politics, in the domain I am interested in. But perhaps there are these layers of experiences, but I do think we have to, in meta terms, become meta and respond in theorizing democracy. And one answer I have to your question is, there is in fact no, this term grassroots is often used in democracy. It has to be rooted, and then there is this claim that technology could play a role there. And I think now where these metaphors have landed us don't really help us understand how things actually function. So Silicon Valley entrepreneurs can become democracy promoters in one part of the world while doing something entirely different in another part. Bezos owns Washington Post in the US, but Amazon also has a role in India. And I think there is, in a sense, technology is the exact mirror for democracy today. So whatever terms we would use, we have to learn from them. And in fact, technologists as a kind of entities and individuals and groups, what they bring to the table, to politics, is very interesting. And I'm currently also studying some of the role of IT expertise in political campaigning, in what we call digital politics, but also canvassing for social movements. Woke politics depends heavily on funding from Silicon Valley. If you look at Black Lives Matter, for example, some of the funding comes from technology investors. The criticism of the Silicon Valley Bank failure is that they were too woke with their hiring, but not enough attention was paid in what financial investments they were driving. So I think democracy has been eaten by technology, and there is no denying that we have not caught up in that theory in being meta enough. I would not credit political science to have done a good job there. Anyways, on that provocative note.
On that provocative note, open to the questions.
Just a clarification. So the Pakistan National Identity Database. So my understanding of Aadhaar and data collection in the US is that you provide your core identity data, and then that then gets connected to all sorts of other things that you do in your life, right? Where you travel, your medical records and so on is all exposed to the government, and one suspects that information is part of the database and linked to your identity or whatever. And that's where the privacy concerns come about. So from what I could tell, it sounded like the NADRA system does not collect all that. It's pure kinship and your identity. And
That's right.
And okay. And so first of all, is that true? And then does that potentially explain this convergence of democracy, because it's not as insidious?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I see what you're saying. So I think that, the way that it works is Aadhaar, because it was so much later, so NADRA was the year 2000 and Aadhaar is 2015, I want to say 14?
9 onwards.
2009 onwards, sorry, okay. This is the
But
NADRA propaganda speaking. They didn't even get it together.
2008 was the first, and Sonia Gandhi became the first person to acquire the Aadhaar.
Wonderful.
It was very political. It was from the start something else.
Yeah.
Unlike NADRA.
Right.
I don't know who was the first person who was given the...
I don't think they did it. They actually did it through almost like they had an ordinance first, and then it went through Parliament, and so there just really wasn't the same kind of public debate that there was around that. And I think it was also a different moment, right?
Yeah.
So, but all to say that, Aadhaar was immediately thought of as like this platform. That's how they framed it, that it would connect all of these things, and that it was very much around welfare leakages, and that's partly, and most biometric ID systems actually are about welfare provision, whereas in the Pakistani case, it was very pretty explicitly about securitization, especially because it aligned with that 9/11 moment. But that's not to say that it doesn't collect certain kinds of data, because the NADRA system is used for, as I said, one of these, for women, forever married women. So I did go into some of those offices of welfare, and I tried to see how much information sharing they were doing. But they really segment off that section of the database so that they are not able to access all of NADRA's data, and NADRA is not able to access all of their data. So they do want to maintain, they do run like when the not these floods, but when the 2010 floods happened, so they did issue cards, they do the internal displacement, they manage weapons licenses, for SIM cards, but that doesn't mean that everything is being collected all the time in this kind of like vision that we have of how a surveillance system works. They can potentially access all that information, but they have to do it on a case-by-case basis. And partly, from my understanding in speaking to NADRA officials, is that they don't want to be liable for that kind of data collection. Neither do they have the full capacity because it's just so much information. And they are running, like while they use things like, Oracle and of course those sorts of systems, they are using a lot of their own custom-made software. So it's a little, like, I think NADRA, has done a lot, and they run like a clean operation. It's a very high-tech space. But of course, if you go to their website, or if you've had the good fortune of trying to renew your ID card from here, you'll see it's kind of a janky, like they're using a technology that's not So that's partly, I think that it is a surveillance mechanism, but it's not the sort of Orwellian system either.
Yeah, that does work exactly opposite in India. So India stack is the Aadhaar database is just the first layer, and then it links to all the other things. Maybe not gun licenses, which is an interesting thing to have linkages to, but they're mostly focused on what they call domains. So now health is huge because I think maybe you would know more, but it's one area because this is what I think it differs in a sense what democracy can do in a country which has very low income population and consumption is largely essentials and not, communication isn't actually very much on the radar because the consumption is very cheap to communicate in India. It's almost, I've moved here and I'm like, I could run my house in India, what I pay for broadband here. It's almost, it's been made universal through very low costing. But the data part of it is then fed to other aspects which are very big. So for example, health, which is not consumption, but is being turned into consumption. Education is, I think, on the radar. All kinds of government services are now being linked to. So it's much more of a surveillance state, while I would say NADRA is the classic security state. So there is this, I think, distinction also there, maybe. Just the economic aspects of it is very distinct.
I had kind of like a follow-up question to what you were saying about NADRA not being interested in entering the other spheres of information. So I think what immediately popped up in my mind is how the Pakistani government linked COVID vaccines to your CNIC.
Oh, yeah.
And then using that, they actually blocked certain individual SIM cards. So I know a lot of people, especially in the lower socioeconomic segments, were immediately now getting vaccines even though they didn't originally want to because they wouldn't be able to make calls anymore. So do you see maybe NADRA going more towards that direction, or do you see the Pakistani government trying to push NADRA in that direction so that they can link those different spheres together?
Yeah, no, you're right. I think that the COVID moment was a very interesting moment in that way. And now with, actually, speaking of health, because the new government, the PTI government, not new, no longer exists, who knows what happened, they did start the Sehat card program, right? So there was a massive health infrastructure that actually does go through NADRA. And even the COVID vaccinations were all recorded by through the NADRA information infrastructure. So it definitely is doing that. And the CNIC blocking, I think, is very interesting because this may seem offhand, but I think it speaks to your question about how it operates on a kind of micro-political level almost, where for Aurat March, for International Women's Day, somebody in Lahore, this guy, petitioned the High Court to say that Aurat March was illegal and they shouldn't be allowed to go. And the High Court justice responded by saying, you have wasted the time of the court. And if you do anything like this, so you fined him 20,000 rupees or something and said, if you do something like this again, we're going to tell Nader to block your CNIC. And I like read that part of the report, was like, what? Like, how is this person losing his citizenship over? I mean, great, like maybe that's the solution to misogyny. But you know, it was a moment where I'm like, how is this being, like there is a kind of micropolitics to how the CNIC works in all these domains. And there is a pretty, like, you know, I saw it in the archives where Maulana Bashani or political figures were also threatened with not being given passports or things like that. So there's a kind of longer history, I think, of this sort of punitive action around identity cards. But the sort of stacking that I think Aasim was speaking to, I think is, I do want to be careful about how the database architecture works, and it is different because it's not a stack in the same way.
Wait till the tech bros get access to the state. And I think that phenomenon in Pakistan was just about to.
No, the tech bros are in Nadra.
Right.
So they run the technology and development
But
department.
they watched over them. They don't run crazy.
Yeah, they're like, we don't have free reign here because we work for a government agency. But
Yeah.
they came back, like the Usman Mubin, who was the ex-chairman who got removed, who graduated from MIT and worked in finance in New York and on Wall Street for really long. Yeah, so they're already there, but in a different.
I think they're looking for an opening, and that hasn't come yet.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I mean, you know, we've talked ad nauseam about this, and I love it, and you know how interesting this project, I mean, I think this project is. But actually, like, I mean, it is a question that's like, I think been going around, and like, it's not stacking per se, but I think I kind of want to understand the relationship of Nadra to the land digitization databases, right? So like, and primarily because Nadra is essentially kind of linked to kinship, and like it kind of deploys kinship to identify the individual. So what is the relationship of this individuation process to property?
Yeah.
And digital property, which is, as you know, in South Asia, impossible to create, right? So how does that work, right?
Yeah.
Because there is a huge digital land digitization database in Pakistan as well. So like, what is the relationship? I'm just curious. I don't
If I may just tag on a question to that, is in the face of territorial uncertainty.
Yes.
Which has also the historically specific moments, also where what is the boundary of the land and the boundary of the people are both in question, and so there's a double uncertainty.
And just like to kind of, you know, with two finger I've learned this new thing, because we talked about this last night, as in like what is its relationship to the settlements, right? The colonial settlements that created property in South Asia. I mean, created like kind of you know, reinforced property regimes in South Asia.
Yeah, those are really excellent questions, and I can. Yeah, it's very complicated because I think on one hand, like, of course, part of what I think property is one of the domains where individuation actually first emerges, even for the pre-colonial and the colonial state, because that is a place where even as property was jointly held in places like Punjab or the frontier and also all across South Asia, even in that moment, you did have to determine who was part of the shareholder, who was part of the corporate body that could actually hold property. So I think it's one of the first places where in the revenue records, so I wrote a paper on this where I describe how the shajra and nasabs, are in fact a product. Of course, people have their own shajras too, but the shajra and nasab is a function, it's a product of the revenue department. And that's because those genealogical charts and the mutations that the colonial government makes every however many years were really crucial.
So, sorry, differences. Shajara is the Satbara, right? Like the kind of genealogical.
It's a genealogical chart, of who has held property, in a certain location, and it runs through mutations. And so that was, of course, that was one way where there was one place where I actually saw a very close attention to individuals and not just groups or representatives. Of course, the question of women here is really crucial, of like where they're able to inherit or not, like where they disappear out of the record, and all of that is really, really important. So yes, like that's, and even today in Nadra's registration centers, one of the things that they're really attuned to with who is claiming kinship to who is to really figure out whether it's going to be a problem for inheritance claims down the road. So yes, like that is individual identity in court is a really crucial part. So even if you look at the family registration certificate, one thing that Nadra will say is like, this is a document that can be used in court only if it's further verified through. So it's not always automatically verifiable. Now what you're saying with the land digitization and the stack is a little separate, because Punjab is the only, at this moment, as far as I remember, last I checked, the only province that has actually done a lot of the land digitization. Even Islamabad, it's not to the same extent. And yes, you do need a CNIC to go and like claim, this is my property record. But it's not like those two systems are, again, stacked, right? But I think it is something that like in the future, the idea is that you would be able to, speaking to your work, like cut through the Patwari system through this. But is it actually going to happen? Who knows? I think, Wazir, the question that you're raising about, the territorial uncertainty, I think it's actually at the heart of a lot of this, because I think the boundary of the people and boundary of land, and this is, we were having this conversation last night actually about how hard it is to figure that out across over the long durée, because it shifts so much, not just on the major moments that I've looked at, like 1947 or 1971, but even before that, especially if you're thinking about the changes that happened with frontier settlement. So I think it's been a really tough question for me, because it comes up constantly where people will speak to. So I remember this one moment really vividly, because it defined it for me, where there was a man and his father who come in, and the data entry operator asks them where they're from, and instead of just naming the district, he says Musa Khel, and he can't find Musa Khel on his drop-down menu of addresses. So he's like, what is this Musa Khel? Like, tell me the actual district. And the older man just goes on this long rant about who Musa Khel are, and like lists 7 generations of Shajras. And he's like, is this a place? Is this who you are? Like, what are you talking about? And of course it's both, right? So there's like a way that I think who people are and like what the place of origin is still one of those, again, the place where individuation and classification do come together. But especially in migrant contexts, especially for tribal groups migrating to Islamabad, some of those things get like untethered, but then re-inscribed, creating like what I'm trying to think through as like the frontier that emerges in the city through these identification technologies. So even as like, the database seems to be this kind of disembodied form, or a thing that's accessible anywhere, centralized, place and territory like keep re-emerging within it in really counterintuitive ways.
Ask a question. No, but thank you all of you actually. My question was really about continuing this thing of linking and what is NADRA, what are the other databases or the fundamental sort of structures or other programs that it connects to, and your story is actually one of surveillance and, in a sense, exclusion, right? Like you're cracking down on, in a way, to exclude. And I wonder whether, again, the comparative case in India is that one is used sort of the census or other forms of kinship-based documents
are sort of used to argue for inclusion, and and biometrics becomes a way to, when you link the two, biometrics becomes a way to deal with the data and sort of deal with the inclusion errors versus the other form of structuring data is to deal with exclusion errors. And just one concrete example, for instance, with ration cards. When you link the two for access subsidized food grain, when biometrics don't work, you go back to the ration card and say so and so is, husband, wife, children, mother, father, father-in-law, etc., to bring people back into sort of the welfare state, to be able to access the welfare state. So I'm just curious to know whether you've seen sort of similar, and you anticipate, your story sort of flipping in some ways, of where these kinship-based data structures could actually be used
for inclusion claims. Absolutely. I think Aasim was speaking to this about also like the kind of, the with broadband almost, like there's a way that, or surveillance, like there's a way that it is maybe a counterintuitive politics, but in fact that happens all the time, because in Pakistan, even people who are the direct subjects of this surveillance system definitely want the ID card, right? So it's like, they're not saying, very few, I mean, there are people who like don't and are fine being off the grid, but most people need it and want it, especially in urban areas. I do want to be specific about that, or for people who travel frequently between urban and rural areas. So I think the demand for inclusion actually does work through kinship, because then they rely on, if for example they're blocked out of the system, they do rely on other family members who are not blocked to vouch for them. And so that like system of social relations is the only way back in some ways. It's also, but it's double-edged, because them being blocked, that kinship link also spreads like contagion, so it could block them. And so it's that double-edgedness, I think, that the state really instrumentalizes in this moment, but it's the only way in or out, Yeah.
So I actually, just to follow back and also reflect on territorial aspects of the kind of anxieties that these things generate. And if you think of the CA&RC moment also in terms of as a data moment, which for your benefit was an exercise where there were the purported purpose was that people experiencing religious persecution could come to India and gain access to. And so inclusion and exclusion, as much as they sound like positive and negative, are very complicated terrains themselves. Inclusion of minorities fleeing from Pakistan to India and being given citizenship shouldn't worry people, apparently, right? But in principle, what they were also doing was that they were not including Muslims who were being persecuted to get the same service. And what I think really we need to think about here is that it's not necessarily the question of inclusion and exclusion, it's the weaponization of certain procedures to then target population within. So the real concern that people had was that it's not about we don't want others to get citizenship here, but tomorrow this could become the pretext to exclude within certain groups and saying, you prove how are you originally citizens here. And I think this kind of political awareness is at the heart of any democracy. People are not like voting just because they're being paid to do that, or people are not demanding I-cards because they want just ration. There is a self-making that goes on in all these exercises. And when they don't give the papers for the first time, it never happened during census. So there's so much literature on, so for example, Appadurai has a piece on how colonial categorization creates a whole kind. But if you see the people conducting the census, they were deployed by the state as permanent employees, so it became a process. And I think the employment prospects for Nadra workers is a very big reason why people would not question these exercises until they begin to suspect that this can have this ulterior motive of later on backfiring. And I think this agency, this awareness, is actually what democracy is about. It's not really just about franchisement. It's about understanding how that relates to your self and belonging to a political community. And I think in all these exercises are very interesting around the border areas. And one of the precedents that I find where this distinction begins to show up is in political science. So the very different literature around frontier political sort of zones as a domain of ethnographers, and heartland being the heart of democratic political kind of churning. And I think these have shown up even in writings about democracy in India. Frontiers are rarely the sites for theorizing democracy. And then heartlands are where it goes on the kind of ideological debates and identity politics. But actually, frontiers are zones also of what are the limits of our democracy. And I think those questions are neither addressed nor ever raised problematically, even in critical literature on democracy.
We have a reception outside.
Yeah. Let's get food. Yes. Thank you.